In Hollywood's golden age, what appeared on screen was only half the truth. While studios sold romance, honor, and flawless masculinity, a darker reality unfolded behind closed doors. Fame was more than power, it was permission. Permission to cross boundaries, bend rules, and escape consequences. These men were not just charming stars, they were protected assets. Studios staged relationships, controlled the press, erased scandals, and buried truths for decades. Pregnancies vanished. Careers were redirected. Illusion endured. They were often labeled womanizers, but that word oversimplifies a system built on privilege and silence. When desire becomes a reward of power, who is left to say no? And when everyone wants you, why do so many end up alone? Tonight, we examine 11 notorious male stars of Hollywood's golden age, not to sensationalize and not to judge by modern standards, but to understand how fame, power, and secrecy shaped an era. Hollywood built legends, but someone always paid the price. These stories didn't begin with scandal. They began with admiration, with applause, with a public eager to believe that the men they adored on screen were just as heroic, just as romantic, just as controlled in real life. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the lines between desire, power, and entitlement quietly disappeared. Some of these men pursued women as conquest, others as validation. Some hid behind charm, others behind genius. And while their methods differed, the system that enabled them remained the same: protected, excused, and endlessly forgiven. So where does this pattern truly begin? With a man whose talent was unquestionable, whose charm was legendary, and whose personal excess became a warning Hollywood refused to hear. Before the yachts, before the studios perfected damage control, before the myth of the untouchable leading man was fully formed, there was John Barrymore. Before Hollywood turned scandal management into an art form, John Barrymore was already testing the limits of what fame could excuse. To audiences, he was the great profile, a classically trained actor whose Shakespearean prestige placed him above ordinary movie stars. He represented culture, refinement, and authority, the kind of man whose talent seemed to justify everything. But when brilliance is treated as immunity, where does accountability disappear? Off-screen, Barrymore's life followed a different script. He married repeatedly, pursued countless affairs, and developed a reputation for heavy drinking that followed him from Broadway stages to Hollywood sets. Accounts from the period describe him arriving intoxicated, forgetting lines, and relying on charm and status to smooth over disruptions. Women moved quickly through his life, not as long-term partners, but as momentary relief from an instability he never fully contained. Was this legendary magnetism genuine desire, or a man outrunning the consequences of his own excess? What makes Barrymore significant isn't only how he lived, it's how the industry responded. Studios tolerated his behavior because prestige was profitable. Performances were rearranged. Absences were excused. Press coverage emphasized genius while quietly minimizing collapse. This wasn't negligence. It was an early version of damage control. When protecting the image becomes more important than addressing the cause, does decline become inevitable? The consequences unfolded slowly, then all at once. Marriages failed. Professional trust eroded. By the time his instability could no longer be hidden, Barrymore was no longer an asset to preserve, but a problem to contain. He died in 1942, isolated and diminished, his legend intact, but detached from the man he had become. After all the indulgence and protection, what did Hollywood truly learn from John Barrymore, and how many times would this pattern repeat before anyone paid attention? Warren Beatty belongs to a rare category in Hollywood history, a man who carried the instincts of old Hollywood into the age of modern celebrity. On screen, he projected intelligence, confidence, and effortless authority. Off-screen, those same qualities followed him into a private life that quickly became legendary. The question was never whether Beatty was desirable, but whether anyone around him ever stood a chance of being the only one. Long before his marriage to Annette Bening in 1992, Beatty's romantic history read like a catalog of Hollywood royalty. Natalie Wood, Julie Christie, Diane Keaton, Madonna, the list seemed endless, and what made it remarkable wasn't just its length, but its consistency. Women who knew him often described the same experience, an intense focus that made each relationship feel singular, personal, and consuming. Was this genuine connection, or a perfected performance shaped by fame and power? Unlike earlier generations, Beatty operated in a Hollywood that had learned how to coexist with excess. Studios no longer rushed to erase rumors, publicists reframed them. The press treated his reputation not as scandal, but as sophistication. His behavior wasn't hidden, it was absorbed into the brand. When indulgence becomes part of the myth, does accountability quietly disappear? The consequences of this lifestyle were subtle, unfolding behind closed doors rather than in headlines. Relationships dissolved. Permanence remained elusive. That is why Beatty's eventual commitment stunned Hollywood, not because he chose marriage, but because a man defined by endless pursuit finally chose stillness. After decades of desire and admiration, what did that decision represent? Evolution, exhaustion, or the moment the chase simply lost its power? At the height of Hollywood's golden age, few men were considered more physically perfect than Tyrone Power. With his symmetrical features and magnetic screen presence, he was widely described as the most beautiful man in Hollywood during the 1930s and 1940s. In films like The Mark of Zorro and The Razor's Edge, Power embodied romance and heroism so convincingly that desire followed him everywhere. But behind that flawless exterior, his personal life was anything but stable. When beauty opens every door, what happens when nothing ever closes? Power married 3 times, yet marriage did little to slow his romantic pursuits. He was notorious for intense affairs with co-stars and Hollywood's most sought-after women. His relationship with Lana Turner became especially consuming. After meeting on the set of The Rains Came, the two entered a passionate affair that Turner later described as overwhelming. When Power refused to leave his wife to marry her, the emotional fallout was devastating. Other relationships followed: Judy Garland, Mai Zetterling, Anita Ekberg, each marked by the same pattern of intensity and collapse. Were these love stories, or emotional fires that burned too fast to survive? What set Power apart from many of his contemporaries was the emotional weight he carried into each affair. These were not casual encounters. From the women's perspective, they felt deeply personal and all-consuming. Power had a gift for making each woman believe she was uniquely understood. Yet, the system around him ensured that the damage remained invisible. Studios preserved his image as the ideal romantic lead, redirecting attention away from heartbreak and toward box office success. Studio secretaries and lesser-known women were as drawn into his orbit as famous actresses, but only one side of those relationships was ever publicly acknowledged. When emotional destruction leaves no paper trail, who is held responsible? Power's life ended abruptly in 1958 when he suffered a fatal heart attack at just 44 while filming Solomon and Sheba in Madrid. His death froze him forever in the image Hollywood had crafted: eternally handsome, eternally desirable. But beneath that preserved surface lies a quieter truth. Tyrone Power did not merely play romantic fantasies on screen. He lived them relentlessly, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts that the system never had to answer for. When Marlon Brando appeared on screen in the early 1950s, Hollywood had never seen anything like him. His performance in A Streetcar Named Desire didn't just introduce a new acting style, it unleashed a raw, animal sexuality that shattered every rule of masculine restraint the industry had carefully maintained. Desire was no longer polished. It was physical, restless, and unapologetic. And Brando carried that same energy straight into his private life. When someone refuses to recognize boundaries on screen, how likely are they to respect them off it? Brando married 3 times, but marriage barely intersected with the reality of his romantic life. He maintained simultaneous relationships, fathered at least 11 children with multiple women, and moved through intimacy with the same impulsiveness that defined his performances. What truly set him apart was not the number of his partners, but the absence of categories. At a time when even rumors of bisexuality could destroy careers, Brando ignored convention entirely, openly engaging in relationships with both women and men. When asked about it, he dismissed labels altogether. Was this sexual freedom or a refusal to accept responsibility for the emotional wreckage left behind? His most famous relationship was with Rita Moreno, a turbulent 8-year affair that left lasting scars. Moreno later described Brando as emotionally distant, unpredictable, and impossible to satisfy someone who could make a partner feel desired one moment and abandoned the next. Other names circulated quietly: Marilyn Monroe, Grace Kelly, Ursula Andress, and, according to some accounts, James Dean. The industry looked the other way, not because it didn't know, but because Brando's genius made him untouchable. When talent becomes a shield, who is ever held accountable? Unlike many Hollywood womanizers, Brando did not approach relationships as conquest. His behavior felt almost childlike, driven by immediate need, followed by withdrawal and disappearance. He left behind acknowledged and unacknowledged children, former lovers who spoke of him with a mixture of devotion and devastation, and a personal legacy as fractured as his family tree. Brando revolutionized acting and redefined desire, but at a cost rarely acknowledged. When authenticity is celebrated without limits, what happens to the people caught in its wake? To the world, Charlie Chaplin was the great humanist of cinema, the man behind the tramp, a figure of compassion who stood with the powerless and mocked authority. His films spoke of dignity, empathy, and social justice. Yet, behind that carefully protected image was a private life that revealed a far more troubling use of power. When a man controls not only his fame, but the careers of those around him, where does romance end and exploitation begin? Chaplin married 4 times, and the pattern of his relationships quickly drew attention. 2 of his wives were just 16 when they married him. Another was 18. These were not accidental relationships formed in private corners of Hollywood. They unfolded inside a system where Chaplin owned his studio and held direct influence over young actresses' futures. Aspiring women were drawn into his orbit at moments when ambition, vulnerability, and authority collided. Was this love, or was it access disguised as affection? The most explosive consequence came with actress Joan Barry. Their relationship ended badly, and in 1943, Barry filed a paternity suit against Chaplin, igniting one of Hollywood's most public scandals. Although blood tests, the first of their kind admitted in a California court, proved he was not the father, Chaplin was still ordered to pay child support. The case shattered the protective silence that had surrounded him. Combined with his left-leaning political views, it transformed him from beloved icon into national target. When power finally meets exposure, does the truth still matter? Chaplin's fall from American favor was swift. In 1952, while traveling to London to promote a film, his re-entry permit to the United States was revoked. The man who once embodied Hollywood's conscience was effectively exiled. And yet, even this downfall was incomplete. His final marriage to Una O'Neill, begun when she was just 18 and he was 54, lasted until his death and was described by many as genuinely stable. Does this ending redeem the past or simply complicate it further? Chaplin's story forces an uncomfortable reckoning. How could a figure so devoted to portraying the vulnerable so often exploit imbalance in his own life? And how long did Hollywood protect him before the system decided the cost was no longer worth paying? Howard Hughes defies easy labels. Aviator, filmmaker, billionaire, and one of Hollywood's most methodical pursuers of women, he operated less like a romantic and more like a strategist. While other men relied on charm or impulse, Hughes relied on systems. And when desire is organized with the precision of a business operation, what does intimacy even mean? As the owner of RKO Pictures, Hughes possessed a level of power few men could rival. He discovered young actresses, placed them under personal contracts, housed them in apartments he controlled, and kept them on constant standby. Meetings were arranged, appearances were scheduled. When one woman lost his interest, another quietly replaced her. According to those closest to him, it functioned like an assembly line. Was this romance or acquisition? His list of relationships included some of Hollywood's most celebrated women: Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Bette Davis, Ginger Rogers, Gene Tierney, and many more. Yet even these high-profile relationships followed the same pattern: intense attention, increasing control, and eventual withdrawal. Hepburn later described feeling less like a partner and more like a possession, another object in Hughes's expanding collection. When control masquerades as devotion, how quickly does affection turn into confinement? As Hughes aged, obsession replaced seduction. He fixated on actresses, replayed films endlessly, and imposed increasingly rigid rules on those around him. His mental health deteriorated and his behavior grew erratic. But the system still protected him. His wealth insulated him from consequence. His influence silenced resistance. Women were expected to adapt or disappear quietly. When power removes every obstacle, what happens to consent? When Hughes died in 1976, he left behind a vast empire and a trail of women who described feeling managed rather than loved. His legacy is not one of passion, but of control. A chilling reminder of what Hollywood's unchecked power could become when desire, money, and authority merged without limits. Cary Grant represented something rare in classic Hollywood perfection without visible effort. On screen, he was elegance personified, witty, controlled, impeccably dressed, and emotionally composed. Audiences didn't just admire him, they trusted him. He embodied the fantasy of a man who had everything figured out. But when an image is built on flawless control, what happens when control becomes the obsession itself? Grant married 5 times, each relationship following a familiar arc. Passion came quickly, followed by disappointment, and eventually withdrawal. His marriages to Virginia, Cheryl, Barbara Hutton, Betsy Drake, Diane Cannon, and Barbara Harris reflected a restless search for something that never quite arrived. Between those marriages, Grant pursued numerous affairs, often with co-stars who fell for the man behind the polished exterior. Sophia Loren later recalled his intense pursuit during The Pride and the Passion, marked by relentless attention and declarations of devotion. Was this romance, or the need to mold someone into an ideal that never existed? What distinguished Grant was not excess, but precision. He wanted control over his image, his relationships, and the women in his life. Former partners described pressure to conform: how to dress, how to speak, how to behave in public. The studio system supported this perfection, carefully protecting rumors and reinforcing the image of the flawless leading man. His long domestic partnership with Randolph Scott, with whom he shared a home for over a decade, quietly fueled speculation that could never be acknowledged publicly. When a system demands silence, what truths are erased to preserve the illusion? The emotional cost was real, though rarely public. Diane Cannon later wrote that Grant was searching for in women what he couldn't find in himself: a sense of completion. That search left behind relationships shaped by imbalance rather than intimacy. In his final marriage, decades later, Grant appeared calmer, more settled, as if the pursuit had finally exhausted itself. But the question lingers: was Cary Grant ever truly free, or was he forever imprisoned by the perfection Hollywood required him to maintain? Frank Sinatra didn't simply sing about love, he lived it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. On stage and on screen, he projected confidence, vulnerability, and raw emotional force. To his fans, Sinatra wasn't just a performer, he was an experience. But when emotion becomes identity, what happens when love is no longer enough to contain it? Sinatra married 4 times, yet marriage never defined the full scope of his romantic life. His relationships were famously volatile, driven by passion, jealousy, and fierce attachment. Ava Gardner became the most legendary of them all, a relationship marked by explosive arguments, deep devotion, and public collapse. Their love was so consuming that it seemed to fuel both their creativity and their destruction. When that bond ended, Sinatra reportedly spiraled, emotionally and professionally. Was this romance, or dependency disguised as devotion? Between marriages, Sinatra was linked to an extraordinary number of women: Marilyn Monroe, Angie Dickinson, Natalie Wood, Judy Garland, Lana Turner, and many others. What distinguished him from other Hollywood womanizers was not detachment, but total immersion. When Sinatra loved, he overwhelmed. Former partners described lavish gifts, constant attention, and a sense of being protected until the intensity turned possessive. Raised in a tough, working-class Italian-American environment, Sinatra carried a rigid code of masculinity that framed love as something to be pursued, defended, and ultimately controlled. When affection becomes ownership, where does care end and domination begin? The industry rarely interfered. Sinatra's power extended beyond fame into influence, connections, and fear. Studios, executives, and even journalists tread carefully. His excesses were excused as temperament, his outbursts as passion. The system didn't correct him, it accommodated him. Yet the emotional cost accumulated quietly, carried by the women drawn into his orbit. In his later years, Sinatra found stability with Barbara Marx, a relationship far calmer than those that defined his prime. It suggested not a change in character, but exhaustion, the slowing of a life lived at emotional extremes. Sinatra's legacy is inseparable from intensity, in music, in love, and in conflict. But when everything is lived at full volume, how much damage is left unheard? To millions of moviegoers, Mickey Rooney was the embodiment of wholesome American youth. As the star of the Andy Hardy films, he represented innocence, optimism, and moral certainty, the boy next door who always learned the right lesson by the final reel. But off-screen, Rooney's adult life unfolded in sharp contradiction to that image. What happens when a child star grows up with fame, money, and access long before emotional maturity ever has a chance to form? Rooney married 8 times and pursued countless affairs, often simultaneously. Beauty queens, actresses, dancers, his romantic life moved at a relentless pace that mirrored the chaos of his upbringing in show business. His first marriage, to Ava Gardner, revealed the gap between image and reality almost immediately. Gardner later described Rooney as a compulsive cheater, recounting phone calls from women he was seeing on the side. Marriage did not slow him down. It simply became another stage in a cycle of pursuit and collapse. Was this desire or a lifelong hunger for validation that fame had trained him never to satisfy? The studio system had spent years protecting Rooney as a symbol, not a person. As a child star, his behavior was managed, his schedule controlled, and his public image carefully preserved. When he grew older, that protection didn't disappear, it simply shifted. Excess was excused as temperament. Scandals were framed as private matters. The boy America trusted had become a man Hollywood continued to indulge. When an industry builds a persona before a person is fully formed, who bears responsibility for what follows? Tragedy eventually forced the fantasy to fracture. In 1966, Rooney's 5th wife, Barbara Ann Thomason, was killed in a murder-suicide at Rooney's home while he was away filming. The scandal dominated headlines, exposing a private life far removed from the cheerful roles that had defined him. Yet even then, Rooney pressed forward, returning again and again to marriage and reinvention. He once joked that it was best to get married in the morning, so if it failed, you hadn't wasted the whole day. Rooney later reflected that he had been a 14-year-old boy with the emotions of a 14-year-old, but with money and access no child should ever have. His romantic excess was not born of power alone, but of arrested development shaped by early stardom. Mickey Rooney's story is not just about womanizing, it is about what happens when innocence is commercialized, adulthood is delayed, and the cost comes due decades later. They didn't call him the king by accident. Clark Gable ruled classic Hollywood with a brand of masculinity that felt effortless, unapologetic, and absolute. He wasn't polished like Cary Grant or volatile like Sinatra. Gable's power came from certainty, a quiet confidence that suggested he knew exactly what he wanted and expected the world to make room for it. But when dominance becomes identity, how often does desire turn into entitlement? Gable married 5 times, yet marriage never confined his romantic life. He carried on affairs with many of the leading women he worked with, forming relationships that blurred professional collaboration and personal conquest. His chemistry with Joan Crawford endured across multiple films, a bond both described as real and intense. Ava Gardner later observed that Gable didn't just enjoy women physically, he genuinely liked them, listened to them, and made them feel seen. That quality made him not only seductive, but deeply convincing. When charm feels sincere, how quickly does it disarm resistance? The most consequential of Gable's affairs remained hidden for decades. During the filming of The Call of the Wild in 1935, he had a relationship with Loretta Young that resulted in pregnancy. To protect Gable's image, the studio orchestrated an elaborate deception. Young was sent away, gave birth in secret, and later adopted her own child. The truth was buried until long after both were gone. This was not rumor management, it was erasure. When a system can rewrite reality so completely, who is ever allowed to tell the truth? After the tragic death of his third wife, Carol Lombard, in a 1942 plane crash, something in Gable changed. Friends noted a lingering grief that never fully lifted. His later relationships carried less triumph and more searching, as if the certainty that once defined him had fractured. When the man Hollywood crowned as its ultimate leading male finally lost what mattered most, what was left of the myth? Gable died in 1960, shortly after completing The Misfits, leaving behind an image of confidence generations would try to imitate. Yet beneath that iconic smirk lies a harder legacy, one shaped by power, secrecy, and a system willing to hide the truth to protect its king. Long before the phrase celebrity excess had meaning, Errol Flynn turned indulgence into legend. To the public, he was the embodiment of adventure, the swashbuckling hero of Captain Blood and the adventures of Robin Hood, fearless, charming, and irresistibly alive. Off-screen, that same appetite for thrill spilled into a private life so reckless that it eventually eclipsed his talent. When pleasure becomes a lifestyle rather than a moment, how long can anyone outrun the cost? Flynn's reputation as a seducer was not studio invention. It was cultivated openly, even proudly. He lived aboard his yacht, hosted notorious parties, and pursued women without discrimination, actresses, fans, socialites, strangers. Marriage did little to restrain him. For Flynn, desire was not about intimacy or connection, but conquest and novelty. He once boasted that he preferred his pleasures without limits, a philosophy that shaped every relationship he entered. Was this freedom or compulsion disguised as confidence? The system protected him until it couldn't. In 1942, Flynn was charged with statutory rape involving 2 teenage girls, a case that shocked the nation. Although he was acquitted, the trial permanently altered his image. The phrase, "in like Flynn," once synonymous with effortless success, took on a darker tone. Studios continued to employ him, but the unspoken contract had changed. When the public sees behind the curtain, can the myth ever fully recover? Despite legal troubles and mounting health issues, Flynn refused to slow down. Heavy drinking and drug use accelerated his physical decline, aging him far beyond his years. Yet even as his body deteriorated, his pattern remained unchanged. His final relationship began when he was 48 and his partner just 17, a detail that underscored how little had evolved beneath the bravado. When notoriety becomes identity, is change even possible? Flynn died in 1959 at the age of 50, looking decades older than his years. He left behind a legacy defined less by performance than by excess, a man who lived exactly as he pleased and paid for it in full. Hollywood had celebrated his recklessness when it was profitable, distanced itself when it became uncomfortable, and ultimately remembered him as a cautionary emblem of an era without restraint. When indulgence is endlessly rewarded, what finally forces the reckoning? Taken together, these stories reveal more than individual excess. They expose a system that rewarded desire, protected power, and treated consequences as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a reality to be faced. These men were not identical in temperament or motivation. Some chased pleasure. Others chased control. Some were driven by insecurity, others by entitlement. But all of them operated inside a Hollywood that allowed boundaries to dissolve quietly and repeatedly. For decades, studios shaped public fantasies while absorbing private damage. Careers were preserved, truths were postponed. Women were expected to endure, disappear, or remain silent. The cost rarely appeared on screen, yet it accumulated in broken relationships, erased histories, and lives permanently altered beyond the spotlight. It would be easy to reduce these men to caricatures, or to judge them by standards that did not exist in their time. But doing so would miss the larger point. This is not simply a story about who they slept with. It is a story about what unchecked power makes possible, and how long an industry can protect its legends before the truth inevitably resurfaces. Hollywood built myths that still shape how masculinity, desire, and success are imagined today. But every myth requires sacrifice. And long after the applause fades, the unanswered question remains: who paid the price, and why was it allowed to happen for so long?